to be 10 people out here wanting to talk about landscaping and landscape design. Well, I guess a lot of people are thinking that the yard could look better. How many of y'all have new landscapes that you're just starting with? Anybody have new houses? Okay. And how many have existing homes that you want to make some changes with? And how many are just here to learn? Okay. Well, there are so many things to talk about. It's hard to know exactly where to start. What I want to do today is kind of introduce you to a lot of the principles, the things that will help you develop a landscape that will be what you have and can enjoy for years to come. I think probably the first and most important thing to tell anybody about developing a landscape design is it needs to be pleasing to you, period. It should be, you're going to spend your time working with it, you're going to live with it, you're going to live in it. Don't let anybody else tell you what is right or wrong. I can tell you it's very important in understanding the plants that you use, that you plant things in the proper amount of shade or sun. We talk about that all the time. We keep size in mind. Don't plant a 20-foot tree right in front of a 3-foot window where you want something low along the front. But there's no package. You can't go out and read a book that tells you put this landscape into your home. And the kind of questions that you need to ask yourself before you even start thinking about a landscape design are who's going to use the yard? And obviously the answer is you. But if you happen to have a little black lab like I do, that's going to have some influence on who uses the yard and what you plant and what you don't. You're going to have kids, you're going to have grandkids. Who's going to be using the yard? How much time are you going to spend in the yard? Are you a person who... Y'all come on in. There's room in here. Everybody's friendly. It's not like the winter when everybody wants to snuggle together to be warmer, but there's places here. But, who uses yard? What are you going to use yard for? Are you a person who loves your air conditioning and spends all the time in front of a TV? Well, in that case, you don't need as much in the way of the yard as somebody like me, who would spend every possible minute outside. And, yards should be inviting places. Landscapes should be inviting places. If you enjoy being outside, you should plan that little private seating area out there where you can put a fountain out there to have some nice sound as well as appearance. You should plan that table and chairs set out there where you can sit out and have that cup of coffee or tea in the morning, have that glass of wine in the evening, or whatever. Some people, you're going to have a hot tub. I remember working with some folks one time that said they just needed a place to escape from their kids periodically. And they created the most incredible little private garden off the master bathroom, complete with hot tub, fountain, just most beautiful little relaxing area. And it's just their little world, their little private world that they go to get away from everything else. So probably the first and most important thing to realize is that you need to decide how you're going to use that landscape. And the landscape should be pleasing to you, not to your neighbors, not to what it's supposed to look like when you drive up and down the street. I knew one guy that loved his vegetables so much, but his yard was so shady, he planted tomato plants out in that little patch of dirt between the sidewalk and the street. Lost about half the produce to people walking by, but again, just don't ever let anybody tell you how to create your landscape. And there are a lot of people that want to call a landscape designer and say, just come draw me a landscape plan. That's totally unfair to the person trying to draw it, because it all depends on how you're going to use it. And if you just don't know where to start, you start by driving up and down the street, around the neighborhoods, and when you see a landscape that you like, stop and try to figure out what it is you like about that landscape. Stop and identify what appeals to you. Most often it's color. People notice color in the landscape more than they notice anything else. But sometimes it may be the shape, sometimes it may be the specific plants, sometimes it may be the overall look. It looks like just a nice little garden instead of a broad expanse of grass. On the other hand, maybe it's a broad expanse of grass that appeals to you. But before you do anything else, start with trying to figure out what you like. It's great to look in magazines and things, but the only thing you're going to get out of a magazine is a general shape and a general concept. I can't tell you how often people bring in a picture out of Southern Living and say, I want this in my yard. And I look at it, and it's 17 plants, 16 of which won't grow here. So don't get too hooked on an individual plant. Don't bring me beautiful pictures of cherry trees. If you want to have blooming cherry trees in your yard, move to Washington. It's just not going to work here. If you want lilacs, move to California. If you want rhododendrons, move to East Tennessee, whatever. Look at those pictures and get ideas. I mean, you can get ideas about materials. You can get ideas about how to create pathways. You can get ideas about how to build decks or gazebos or whatever. And those are all very useful things, but certainly don't get attached to the plants that you see in those pictures. Now, for those of y'all who are working with... Come on in. There's an indicating room up there. That's all right. That's all right.
Thank you.
I was surprised too. Very, very flattering. Okay, for those of y'all who have existing landscapes that you are looking to upgrade, the biggest mistake that you make is being attached to anything that's in the yard. Now, I realize there may be sentimental attachments, you know, a plant that someone gave you or a plant you planted in memory of somebody else, but the fact that it's green and growing does not mean that you are married to it. You did not adopt these things. They're not children. They're not pets. And if they're in the wrong place, if they're no longer pleasing to you, I mean, if you just can't bear to do anything else, dig them up and give them to the neighbor if you can't stand to cut them down. But one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make with their landscape is feeling like you have to live with what's there. And I see this in new homes as well as old homes. Because it used to be, in order to get a VA loan, you had to have two trees, 8 shrubs, and grass in the front yard. These people are buying a $100,000 house. Some fly-by-night landscapers put $150 worth of plants in the yard, but people think they have to keep those landscape plants. You know, you don't. And in a lot of cases, the plants that were attractive when your home was built are no longer attractive. One of the most common problems that I see is when the home was built and it was landscaped, the trees were small. And people put in these shrubs that take nice bright sunlight. And all of a sudden, just overnight, those trees turned into these huge monsters. The poor boxwood is leaning 3 feet out away from the house. It no longer is pretty. And I get all these calls about, in effect, how can I make it pretty again? You can't. You use this marvelous product. Come on in, there's still room in here. There's this wonderful product, and I joke because I think Jerry Parsons is the one that originally came up with the term, but the product is called Chainsaw, and it's applied right at ground level. And you just have to bite the bullet. Sometimes, to me, it's like house cleaning. You just have to be in the right mood. You know you got a ton of stuff you need to throw away. You just can't make yourself do it. Your landscape's the same way. There are plants out there that simply need to go. Whether they're a mistake that you made, or whether they're a mistake the landscaper made, or whether their plants simply are not doing well because the conditions in your yard have changed. But, you know, just start. When you're looking at your home, new or existing, and you're saying, I want to create a landscape plan, just blank out everything that's there, probably with the exception of the big shade trees. And ask yourself, do I wish something else was there? And let's face it, I mean, plants do cost some money, but think what you spend money on. You spend $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 on a house. You go out and spend $20,000 to $50,000 on a car. You're like me, you spend $4 for a cup of chai in the morning. Do you think this little plant right here that costs $15 that you should totally alter your lifestyle rather than disturb that one plant? You've got to be willing to give up a lot of what's there if you really want to create, you know, the landscape that's going to be pleasing to you. Now, landscapes are a lot more than just plants, and I would start with any landscape plan. I would start with some of the things I mentioned. Who's going to use the landscape? And, you know, ask yourself what features you would like to have in the landscape. Now, not everybody can afford to go out and do the entire landscape at one time. In fact, most of us can't. Most landscapes will be developed over a period of time, but it is important that you start with an overall plan so that you know where you want to go. I mean, if you're going on a trip, you don't just get on the highway and start driving, at least hopefully you don't, and think, well, gee, where am I going to wind up? You know, you should have an ultimate destination somewhere down the end of the road, and you do the same thing with that landscape. And you know, if it may cost some money to do what you want to do. You may be totally attached to that $1,500 fountain up front that you really want, and it's not in the budget today, but you know it's going to be someday, or you know you're going to talk your husband or wife or kids or whoever else into giving you that. But plan your landscape and get an overall plan in mind. And even if it takes you 5 or even 10 years to develop that plan, when you get through, you will have something absolutely wonderful. And I know everybody says, well, gosh, I don't know if I can wait 5 years. Well, think back to something that you were doing 5 years ago, and how quickly did that time go between then and now? It goes about like that. So even if it's going to take you a little while to create that landscape, it's certainly worth having the long-term plan in mind. Make a list of the features that you would like to have, whether it's water, whether it's a lily pond, whether it's a waterfall, whether it's a private seating area, whether it's just a simple bench out there. If you want to bring wildlife in, do you want to plan for bird baths and bird feeders? If there's some particular piece of statuary you love, be it antique or be it modern, just look at these things and just make that list of, I want to have these things in my landscape. Maybe it's a vegetable garden, maybe it's a cutting garden, maybe it's a patch of grass so, the dog will have a place to go out. But stop and first of all, ask yourself, what all do I want to have in that landscape? And then you can start thinking about where you're going to put these things, how you're going to accomplish your overall plan. And especially if you have an existing house, before you really start thinking about exactly what you're going to do in the landscape, look at the house and see if there's some features you might want to change on it. A house that was built 50 years ago is probably a lot better built than a house that you're going to build today, but it looks like a house that was built 50 years ago. You'd be amazed how much of a change you can make in a house simply with a new front door, or maybe with some shutters, or maybe with repainting. But, if you're going to change the paint color or whatever, I'm redoing this on my 103-year-old house up in Bernie, and believe me, I'm going with some daring colors right now that 15 years ago I probably would have never thought of putting in there. But that's going to influence to some extent what you plant. But again, a landscape is not just plants. It's those other features. It's the statuary, it's the fountain, it's the bench, it's the color of the home, it's changes that you may make to the home itself. So the first thing you really need is a good overall plan. And you're going to get that plan by studying your house, by studying the homes that you have looked around that you like, and perhaps by looking through the myriad of magazines and books and things that are out there. By the way, if you see a landscape that you really like or a plant that you really like, I can almost promise you, if you go up and knock on the people's door, they will be totally flattered that you like their landscape, and they'd be happy for you to take pictures or ask all the questions about where they got this or how they planted that or whatever else. I don't recommend just driving down the street and taking pictures, or people may really wonder what you're up to, but I don't think I've ever, in this back years ago when we did a book and we stopped and asked permission to take a lot of pictures. Sometimes I didn't tell the people I was taking pictures of a bad example, but I don't think I ever asked anybody if I could take a picture if they weren't absolutely flattered that you wanted to do that. And so start by putting all these ideas together. Let me pause for just a second. How many of y'all are new? How many of y'all have not been to a seminar here before? Okay, lots of folks. We do play kind of an interesting game here. And what I do, I'm very informal. If you have a question as we go, please stick up your hand and ask. If it's something I'm going to cover in a little while, I'll put you off. If it's something that's appropriate to answer then, I'll be happy to stop and answer. But the game we play is, if you don't want to admit to something that's going on in your own landscape, it is perfectly acceptable to say, my neighbor couldn't come, but they wanted me to ask. Came up with a new one the other day. Somebody kept saying, well, my son wanted to know about this. My son wanted to know about this. I don't think the guy had kids, but it sure was a good excuse. But anyway, so don't hesitate to ask any questions as we go along. But you've got an idea of the things that you want to incorporate into your landscape. And then you look at your existing landscape and you see what can't be changed. Now, in my opinion, there are only 2 or 3 things that can't be changed. Some things take a little more trouble to change than others, but the thing that can't be changed is where your house sits on the lot. And if you have big mature trees that you want to save, those things are things that will remain. And you start out by drawing, with a good sized piece of paper. You're going to start out putting on that piece of paper the existing facilities that have to stay in place. You probably got a plat when you bought your home. If not, you could probably get it from the tax office that has the dimensions and has the location on the house if you're not a good enough of an architect to go out and measure it off and put it there yourself. The other thing that's very important to know when you're first getting started is, are there any easements on the property? Easements mainly for utilities. They could be underground power lines, and of course it could always be other underground lines. But you need to know any easements that are on the property. Having an easement on the property doesn't mean that you can't do anything with that spot. Doesn't mean you can't plant things in an easement. All it means that is if CPS or SAWS or somebody decides they want to drive through that easement with a bulldozer and rip up everything in the world, they don't have to pay you for it. They screw up stuff that's on your property that's not in an easement, they are obligated to compensate you for any damage that they do, whether it's to sprinkler system, whether it's to plants, whether it's to anything else. But in an easement, you do anything you want, but if they mess up what's in that easement, it's your responsibility. They are not under any obligation to pay for it or replace it in any way. So it's very important to know if there are any easements on your property. You just put that on your general site plan, so to speak, of what you started out with. And that's, for now, that's probably all the drawing that you're going to do on that initial plan. Now you're going to get a bunch of pieces of tracing paper, and you can buy this stuff, go to an office supply store, you can buy big pieces, you can buy it in rolls. Most of the people that I know that do this all the time will unroll it and tear off a piece, and you may end up with 15 layer upon layer upon layer as you work and decide what you want. But that tracing paper beats all the erasers in the world. But you've got to start out with the things that can't change. Now you say, well, what about the sidewalk? What about the driveway? Things like that. One of the worst things in the world is the standard sidewalk that the builder put in the house. The street is here, the house is here. Where's the sidewalk? Chung! Right straight down the middle and up to the front door. I'm going to talk to you about some different optical illusions that we use in creating landscape designs, and that's one of the most important ones. The shortest distance between 2 points, both physically and visually, is a straight line. And if you want to make a house look close to the street, you put a straight sidewalk from the street up to the front door. If you want to make the yard look bigger and more interesting, you get out there and you rip that sidewalk out and you put a curving sidewalk that does this. Literally, drive up and down the street. And I want you to drive around and look at these things and see what I'm talking about. But if you want to create the illusion of more space, curves are what you do it with. If you've got this house that you want for some reason, you want it to look shorter, smaller, whatever, straight lines, straight sidewalks, straight flower beds, straight driveway, straight everything. If you want to add interest to it and make it look much larger, you will use curves, both in the beds, perhaps in the driveway. Depends on how well you drive. Curving driveways are very bad on people that can't drive well. But at least with the sidewalk, everybody can hopefully walk on a curving sidewalk. But anyway, so I would not consider, in most cases, I certainly wouldn't consider the sidewalk to be a permanent feature. Depending on your home, the driveway may or may not be. But that's why I say don't necessarily think of these things as things that you have to stay with, things that you have to live with. It's one of the biggest things you can do to change the appearance is going to be to rip that sidewalk out and do something different. So you've got your base plan here, and you know what stays and what has to go. The next consideration is, do you have a sprinkler system? And if so, is it going to need to be modified? Because sprinkler systems, well, they need to, in most cases, they need to water the grass and the beds separately because we're going to talk about water conservation. Grass is by far your biggest water user in the landscape and has to be watered the most frequently. Beds that are done properly probably will need about a third as much water as the grass does. And if you have an existing sprinkler system that's not zoned to allow that, you may have to make some changes on that. Now, the cost in doing a sprinkler system are basically three different things. You got to start at the meter, you got to put in a backflow valve, you've got to put a controller in and the various solenoids that control the various zones, and then you have your lines that go out and have the sprinkler heads attached. Especially if you have the original plan, changing out where those heads are is not usually a real big deal. And sometimes it's as simple to do as where you've got a 360-degree head, a head that sprays water out all around, and all of a sudden you're going to want to have a line right along there, and this side of it you don't want to water that much. You simply take off that 360-degree head, put in a 180-degree head. You haven't had to do any digging to speak of or anything else. But look at your sprinkler system and decide if that's going to need to be modified to accommodate your new plan. If so, then that probably, once you get your plan drawn, that's probably the first thing you're going to address. Because again, I see people that make the mistake of doing these fancy landscapes, and then they think, oh, duh, I should have redone the sprinkler system. The sprinkler company comes in, and sprinkler companies are second only to painters and roofers as far as destroying landscapes. And then they go dig trenches and everything through this area that you worked real hard to create. So look carefully at your sprinkler system and whether or not that will need to be modified. The next thing I would do is to decide on the areas that you would like to have what we call hardscape. And that may be a wooden deck, that may be a deck made of decomposed granite like this walkway is out here. It may be a flagstone deck, it may be a brick deck, or a brick patio at least, and I'm going to give you some different hints about the materials you're going to use in just a minute. But work on deciding where you would like to have these hardscape features. And the best thing you can do is, like I say, you've got your tracing paper. Sometimes, take another sheet of paper and cut out something to scale the size of what you want to create, and then just move it around on your plan until you find the right place. When it comes to laying out beds and things like that, it's many times easiest to do standing out there looking at the house, and a garden hose or a piece of heavy rope is a wonderful thing because you can stretch it out, you can wind it back and forth, you can put it in 100 different positions trying to get the shape that you're looking for there. And then once you figure it out, you can go back and commit that to paper, or if you're ready to do it, you go out and put some stakes along since you've already got it laid out. When you're doing your designs and things like that, when you come up with something you like, commit it to paper almost immediately because you never know what's going to happen. We kind of like, over at least in the original part of the nursery, you notice how all the walkways wind back and forth and all. Just a little story to tell you how it was. We just finished rebuilding that building. We had several hundred little scraps of wood left over, and we spent 2 or 3 days out there laying out all our sidewalks using those little scraps of wood. At the time, Roberta's mother was working for us, but she just had some surgery and she wasn't there every day. So one day we were out working on a job, and she was over here where we were building an office getting ready to do all this, and she noticed all this junk out the back and took a bucket, went around and gathered up all the pieces of wood that we had spent days laying out. But guess what? We got up on the roof and took a picture of it before we had gone off to do whatever else, so we could get the picture back and go out and lay it all out again. But when you're doing this sort of thing, make some sort of record. And I mean, a camera is the best thing in the world. These days with the digital camera, they are so easy, so inexpensive. There's not any developing and processing and anything else. Take pictures as you go along so that you can come back and refer to those in case the original layout or whatever gets altered in one way or another. But like I say, do record these things well. I want to stop for just a minute and talk about materials that you're going to use. And let me ask first of all, how many of y'all either have or think you would like to incorporate a deck or a patio or something like that into landscapes that you create? Okay, if you're going to use brick for anything, be sure that you have hard-fired American brick. Probably the best brick to use is actually brick that's made out of concrete. And there's several places that sell the concrete stones and the concrete pieces that look like brick. The majority of the brick that comes into this country today is made in Mexico, and it is not hard fired. You can build a house out of it and it will last a long, long time. But when you put brick in contact with the ground, if it's not properly fired, it will absorb moisture. If we happen to have a cold winter, the brick explodes. The walkways that we have up here are mostly brick that is over 100 years old. It came out of an old building torn down downtown. We got at one point, we put a few replacement bricks in that turned out to be the softer Mexican brick. We had a hard freeze, and it just turns to about the consistency of rock salt. And it just explodes, turns into little bitty pieces. Sadly, an old family friend and customer here built a new home not too far from here, and in his backyard he created the most elaborate series of raised planters, of brick walkways, just an incredible work of art that he spent about 2 years working on. We had a moist spell, we had a hard freeze, and about 80% of the brick in that area just crumbled and turned to nothing. Harvey passed away about a year later, and I've always felt that it was at least in part due to the terrible disappointment of having created all this and literally have it turn to dust before your eyes. So if you're going to use brick, it needs to be hard-fired Dahanis or one of the good American bricks, or it needs to be a concrete brick. Don't settle for anything else. And if you're not sure whether it's good hard brick or not, soak it in a bucket of water for an hour or two, then take a hard nail or something like that and try hard to scratch it. If you can scratch a line into that brick after it's been soaking, that soft brick, and do not put it in the landscape. By the same token, when you choose materials for things like bird baths and fountains and things like that, most of those are either going to be clay, concrete, or a rosin product. Again, be sure that you've gotten a good, properly cured material. The great majority of the concrete that you buy out along the roadside somewhere are these people that spring up, and, they've got 15 styles of bird baths and everything else. That concrete is probably not real well cured, and I promise you, we will get back to cold winters one time or another. We just haven't had any winter in several years now. But that concrete will absorb moisture. We get a hard freeze, and it starts to flake off, and you'll be looking for something to replace it. Properly cured concrete will stand up to any weather that you can have. In what we buy here, we buy most of our concrete products come either out of Pennsylvania or out of Illinois. Those folks up there know about cold winters, and they know how to make concrete that will hold up. If you're looking at clay, that white clay comes from a company called Grub Pottery. It comes out of Arkansas. That stands up to a freeze pretty well. The red clay out of Mexico will totally dissolve just with water, and if we ever get a freeze, it just really goes in a hurry. Even the red clay that comes out of Marshall, Texas, even some of the Italian red clay, which is pretty well fired, you may end up with a problem with it if we have, severely cold weather. So understand the materials that you're working with. I think some of the newest, and I'm a person who hates plastic. I mean, don't show me plastic edging, don't show me plastic flowers, don't show me plastic anything. But there are some new bonded rosin materials, and some of the fountains and things that are on the market today that are made out of this stuff are really very good quality. Stand up to weather, stand up to sun, and last a long, long time. Plus, they can be useful in a lot of different ways. Those of y'all that came in through this parking lot, that big fountain that looks like the big stone jar that's right outside the gate there, looks like it weighs about 1,500 pounds. It weighs about 30 pounds. There's some real good materials out there that are much, much lighter weight. What they call the sake fountains that are up here that are like the cylinders with the rings around them, those are very lightweight, made out of a good, durable rosin material that will stand up to the weather. But anyway, choose your materials very carefully when you're looking at concrete and clay, especially anything that's going to be in contact with the ground. Now, as far as wood in the landscape, try any way that you possibly can to never have any wood in contact with the surface of the ground. You're going to run into problems if you do. Even the so-called lifetime quality deck wood and things like that, I can tell you, after 15 years, the original deck we had on the back of the building there was totally rotting away. The way that we have rebuilt. In fact, even in this building, we made some changes when we added those 2 rows up there earlier this year. If you were to look at the supporting structure underneath it, none of that wood is in contact with the ground. It's actually sitting on concrete blocks up off the ground. If you look at these posts, these are cedar, and I tell you, put these things in contact with the ground and they will rot away fairly quickly. But if you were to look down at the base of this post or that post or any of them or any of the ones in the greenhouse complex around here, you'll see that what we did was poured a concrete footing there and set the wood on top of the concrete up above the ground. Anything you can do to keep the wood up off the ground is going to give it a much, much longer life. And again, the new deck that we built on the back of the building, what's it been, 3 years ago, if you could get down and look underneath it, you would see that there are those either 6x12 or 12x12 concrete pads, and that's what the feet for the deck are sitting on top of. There's virtually nothing that's in contact with the ground. Because the so-called treated wood these days, if you look at most of it, they call it above ground use. It is much better environmentally than what was out there 10 years ago. I mean, lots less arsenic, lots less toxic material in it. But it's kind of like the lead in the paint. That's the thing that used to make the paints last. Thank God we got rid of the lead, but it means you're going to repaint your house twice as often. And the same thing with the wood. We got rid of the arsenic, but the new wood's not going to last. So keep it up off the surface of the ground to make it last longer. I like, for some uses, the new synthetic wood, the Trex and some of these other things. I'm not crazy about the appearance of it. But these new woods that are actually made of plastic, or actually a plastic material with sawdust in it, some of them are very realistic, and if absolute long life is critical to you, you probably should look at using this type of material. The thing that I've never understood is why they make these deck surfaces out of this material that's going to last forever, but the stuff you have to build a framework out of, they haven't made any of that stuff out of anything synthetic. So I don't see putting a lifetime quality surface on top of a wooden frame that's going to last 15 or 20 years. Just all things for you to consider, but you know, I have a friend who defines an expert as a person who's killed at least 1,000 plants. I think the same thing's true in the construction industry. An expert's a person who's made at least 1,000 mistakes, and I will admit to being an expert in both areas. So I'm not going to tell you my neighbor made this mistake. I'm going to tell you mistakes that we made or have made around here over the years, and hopefully it'll keep you from making the same mistakes in what you do. But your choice of hardscape materials really is very, very important, and things that you might never even think about become very, very critical. I will also tell you that there is a big difference in the quality of the wood that you buy. I know the idea, it's just so simple to run to Home Depot or run to Lowe's or whatever else to get your wood. If you're in an area where you can deal with a good old-time lumber yard, do so. You would be amazed at the difference. I mean, the wood looks exactly the same today. Virtually all the wood that we use comes from Bergman Lumber up in Bernie. And I don't know where Randy buys his wood, but I remember when they built the Home Depot up there about 10 blocks from his lumber yard, I asked him, I said, do you think these people are going to be any price competition? And he said, well, thought a minute, and he said, I guess if I want to raise my prices 10%, I can compete with them. Just because they're a big place doesn't mean they're cheaper. And I've had the experience of buying, I'll use 2x6s for an example, down the street here, and if you don't nail them into place or screw them into place very quickly, pretty soon they turn into pretzels. It's amazing the shape that a straight board can assume after about 2 or 3 weeks in the weather. But if you get good, what is properly called kill-dried wood, and I mean, if you look right outside here, you'll see some 2x6s that I bought from Randy about 12 or 14 months ago that we simply got too many and didn't need all of them. Actually, it wasn't a mistake in ordering. It was that a certain partner of mine changed her mind after the project was partly underway, and we had some leftover wood. That wood is as straight as it was the day that I picked it up and hauled it in here. So there is a difference in wood, and it doesn't necessarily cost you more to get a real good quality wood. That goes for the metal, that goes for a lot of different things. So don't necessarily think that the closest place in the neighborhood is a place that you're going to get the best materials. But anyway, so your choice of materials is going to be very important. Your source of information on where to get things. You may have a neighbor in the business, you may know a contractor, a builder somewhere that can help. We have no secrets. We'll tell you where we got literally everything that went into the nursery because there are places to get the decayed granite that are better than others, the wood, and a whole lot of other things. But choose your materials, very, very carefully, because again, I don't want you to have to redo this once you really get started into the project. Okay, so we've got our base plan. Yes, ma'am.
What about stamped concrete?
It's pretty neat if it's on a stable surface. Stamped concrete, I would still, if I were putting it out in the yard where there are going to be tree roots and things like that, I would still put what are called expansion joints in it, where the concrete actually ends and you have this piece of fiberboard in between, because if you have expansion joints here and there, it's much less likely to crack. But if you were to pour a concrete stamp a pattern into it that was the size of this building, I can promise you, unless you put 10-foot piers underneath it, it's going to crack within a few years. So I like that kind of look, but be sure you still put some expansion joints in it to avoid cracking in the future. Another question, Barbara?
Yeah, you were talking about materials and brick cracking. When we built our home, we saved 3 huge stones, thinking we were going to put them for a fountain into a pond, sort of natural looking. Then someone came along and said, "Oh, you use those in your pond," and same thing you're talking about the brick. If it gets wet and it freezes, it's going to explode. Someone else told Bill, "No, not that kind of limestone. That's only some kinds of limestone." Gosh, it looks like limestone to us.
The second person is right. There are 2 kinds of limestone. There's a very hard limestone and there's a very soft limestone. You need to talk to somebody that knows rock or talk to somebody that's a reputable stone dealer. Because some limestone, look at the buildings up in Fredericksburg. You'll see buildings that have stood there, for over 100 years, and they look exactly the same as when they were built. But a lot of this limestone that comes not off the surface of the ground but comes from deeper down, it's much softer and it will weather away. So I can't tell you without seeing, the boulders that you're talking about. But I'll tell you, if they were up on the surface to begin with, they probably are good and hard. If they were dug out, I wouldn't be at all sure. If they're up on the surface, they've already weathered. Past 1,000 years has worn the soft part away. But if they're down below the ground, that hasn't happened.
Okay.
That's a real good point. Rock can be very different as well. And by the way, if you're looking for quality rock, there's a company called Stone and Soil Depot that I've had nothing but good experiences with. They're a little ways outside of San Antonio, one of them on I-10, the other on 281. But I've gotten good quality rock and a lot of other materials from them, but that's a good question. Anything else before we move on about materials? Okay. Be sure that you do understand city codes as well. There are a lot of this material, a lot of these things you may be doing yourself, but if you're going to do anything involving electricity or involving water, be sure that you at least know what the laws are. Landscape lighting can be a real neat thing, and if you have that beautiful patio back out there in the corner of the yard, whether you think you'll use it or not, go ahead and run an electric line out there. They have to be 12 inches below the surface of the ground, and there are a couple of materials you have to use a plastic tape on top of them, and there's some things that you just need to know. When it comes to building permits, I hope nobody from the city's here, but my general idea is it's easier to get forgiveness than it is to get permission in many cases. But as far as codes, be sure in advance that you're doing anything you need to meet the codes, most of which are based on reasonable things. I won't say that everyone is. The backflow preventer on the sprinkler systems are new. That's a good thing because of some of the crap that people are finding a way to inject into their landscape water. You don't want that backing up into the system and then coming into your house. I think the rain sensor requirement, which has to be on sprinkler systems nowadays, is probably a very reasonable thing. Now, if we could just teach people how to set those systems so they're not wasting water when they water, that's a whole different story though. But do understand the codes, especially when it comes to electric, gas, and water. And do keep these things in mind, because you not only want to have that patio or that deck or whatever else, the day may come that you may want to have a recirculating fountain, that you may want to have an outlet to plug in a little refrigerator or a coffee pot or whatever else. And landscape lighting may be something that you want to do in the future. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about landscape lighting, but there are some newer low voltage type of lighting systems. Now, I'm not talking about the Malibu lights. Those things, you just don't even think about picking those things up. But they cost a bit of money, but there are some new low voltage systems out there that are excellent, that put out a good intense light. But the lower voltage wires don't have to be buried nearly as deeply as the others do. So again, there are a lot of different things you want to think about when you start creating this landscape plan. The plants are going to be close to the last thing that you think about. Think about your fences. I mean, if you're going to, yes,
Well, going back to sprinklers, somebody said, I mean, we've kind of decided that water restrictions are meant to drive you to get a sprinkler because there's no way you can carry your little hose around and water those spots you want all in one night. So we're talking about getting a sprinkler, and somebody said, well, you better know what kind of specifications you want before you put it in, or you could end up having a huge problem. And I don't know what kinds of specifications those are, and that person I don't have to talk to, so.
Well, you first of all want to deal with a reputable company.
Okay.
And that reputable company is going to need to know what your water pressure is, because water pressure will determine how much water you can put through a given pipe in a given amount of time. And all a sprinkler system is a big mathematical puzzle, because let's say you can get 50 gallons of water per minute out of your city water line, then you can put in any given zone, you can put the heads that will use about 45 gallons a minute, and you'll still get a good spray, you'll still get good pressure. But somebody that doesn't know what they're doing will put too many heads in there, and none of them will spray properly because you've got too many of them on a given zone. You want a good quality timer that gives you a lot of options in how you set it. And it should be simple enough that, you know, if anything's got a computer on it, you either go to school for a month to learn how to use it, or you find a fourth grader to do it for you, since I think we're probably all about the same age in here. But you need a controller that you can understand and that you can program. And I think one of the big things in sprinkler systems is the quality of pipe that you use in the system. There are different wall thicknesses on pipe. And if you're asking 3 companies to bid on a sprinkler system, the guy that wants to cut his price is going to use a thin wall pipe called Schedule 200 pipe. And that is that's very fragile pipe that is very easily broken. I have an iron digging bar that's a magic digging bar. Back in the days when I was doing landscape planning, I could throw that thing up in the air. It would come down, point down on top of the biggest water line in the yard. First time, every time. I learned a lot about fixing broken pipes. But you should specify that, and they will tell you, oh, you don't need that. Out once you're beyond the solenoid, you can use the thin wall pipe. You can use Schedule 200. Just say, I'll pay you the extra 10 or 20 bucks it costs to have Schedule 40 pipe throughout the landscape. And the same thing's true on edging. Do not settle for plastic edging. Get good metal edging. I'm sorry? Yes?
With the sprinklers, do you have to get a licensed person? Do they have to have a license to put it in, or can anybody put it in?
Anybody who follows code can put them in. Now, we're dealing San Antonio, Hollywood Park, Hill Country Village, Alamo Heights, Terrell Hills, Almus Park. I don't know what all the codes are in all the different places. In some places, you may be required to get a licensed installer. But basically, the most important are the 2 things that are absolutely mandated. You have to have a backflow preventer, and you have to have a rain sensor on your system. Beyond that, I don't know. I put my own system in years ago here in San Antonio. We put Roberta's system in when she lived in town. We put her mom's system in. And it's kind of fun. It's kind of a good mathematical challenge, and it's fun to do if you have the time. But just be sure you know what the codes are. And if you're dealing with a company, you know, ask for references and find out how well they stand behind. Again, I don't mind giving you the name. The people that we have used, that we've had best results with, is a company called Alamo Rainmaker. And I've not been disappointed in their work. But some of the other big names, I can tell you problems with. Okay, got the hardscape, got the sprinkler system under control. We've thought about whether we're going to want to put electricity out in these given areas. Look at the fences. If the fences are in bad shape, this is the time to think about changing them before you start doing a whole lot. Because fence companies, again, they want to be able to bring that jackhammer in and all. If your fence needs replacing, do it before you start with your landscape plan. And again, think about materials. There are a lot of choices, a lot of which are very ugly. You can have all the white plastic fence you want. I wouldn't be caught anywhere with it around. But if that's what you like, that's fine. There are some concrete fences out there that really aren't bad if they're properly installed. There's metal, there's wood, there are a lot of different things, but the fence is a whole nother, a whole nother issue. And you can do some fun things. I mean, if you're going to have a gate coming into the yard, consider putting a trellis or an arch over the gate or something like that. You can grow interesting vines. Roberta grows Rangoon creeper over one of her arches, and they're 5,000 flowers open on that every day throughout the summer months. But they're fun things to do with your fences and your entryways. But again, get that decided before you really start on your landscaping. Now, the issues when it comes to actually drawing your landscape design, we're going to think about, again, spatial considerations. If we want to make a big area look smaller, we use mainly straight lines. If we want to make a smaller area look bigger, then we'll tend to use more curving lines, both in the outline of the beds, in the outlines of the sidewalks, and even the edging that goes around the beds. Just everything, everywhere you can incorporate a curved line, it will give you the impression of more space. If your house is either really small or really long and you don't like the look of it, obscure the corners. I mean, the corner defines the end of the house visually. You see the corner, you know whether the house is big or small, square, boxy, whatever else. But in your landscaping, plan on the corners, plan to obscure it with a big planting, either one big plant or a group of planting around the corners of your house, and kind of, have it fade off into a more heavily landscaped area. And when you look at it, you see the plants. You don't necessarily see the corners of the house, and it can greatly change the appearance of the house. If your house has a totally flat front to it and you want to add interest, put a front porch on that brings it out away. Anything that breaks up these straight lines, whether it's a series of straight lines like this or whether it's a curve, you'll very definitely change the entrance. And it's really a pretty simple thing to do to put a front porch or a larger landing area, interior area, whatever you want to call it, where you come up into the house, and you'd be amazed at how much newer you can make an old house look by an interesting porch, maybe an interesting wrought iron railing, maybe some interesting rock work around it, or simply the pots and plants that you put up on that porch when you had the plain old flat front to your house before. Keep that in mind when you're driving around, when you're looking at these landscapes that you like or don't like, and I think you'll find that that's one of the things that you'll find makes a great deal of difference in the appearance of the house. I already mentioned shutters. You'd be amazed, depending on the look that you want. You can change the look of that old, track home look where they put the windows in by simply changing the window treatments, changing shutters, sometimes even altering, the roof line along, the guttering, things like that. There's just some fun things to do if you want to create a little intimate garden area. Virtually every house has those rain gutters along the front of it, and then they have that ugly pipe that comes down and goes wherever you want. Anybody know what a rain chain is? The good ones are interesting and a little more expensive. The cheap ones, they don't look bad and they won't last as long. But a rain chain will be literally a series, like a chain-like series of little cups or little different shaped things, and they keep the water going down, but the water, instead of flowing down through this pipe you don't see, runs into this cup. When it fills over, it runs over to the edge, to the one underneath it, to the one underneath it, to the one underneath it. If you travel in Europe, you'll see a lot of buildings that have these rain chains literally coming down off the roof rather than just a straight gutter pipe. And it can just be really, really interesting. Consider even changing the roof of your house itself. Nowadays, there are some wonderful metal roofs out there that don't have to look like metal. You've always wanted a ceramic tile roof on your home, but it weighs 10 million pounds and you have to totally change the structure of your attic to put it up there. There are Galvalume tile look roofs that are lifetime quality metal that weigh virtually nothing that you don't have to change. Same thing's true of slate, same thing's true of shake shingles. A lot of homes you'll be amazed what a difference it'll make just to put a metal roof of one sort or another on it in place of the composition roof. And if you get a good company, it's the last roof you'll ever put on your home. Now I'll tell you that from experience, because when we did the expansion on the nursery, we paid a lot of money for what we thought was a good metal roof, and it promptly rusted out about 15 years later. Spent 4 times as much as we would have on a composition roof, and it lasted less time than a composition roof would have. And sadly, even though we'd known this builder or this roofer for a long time, he had contracted to have the job done, and This contractor refused to stand behind it, so we got Southwest Metal Roofing Systems and put on a roof with a guarantee that it will last a lifetime. And again, just kind of little side issues you might consider, but these are all things. You're turning your home into a place of greater value and a place that you're going to live for a long time, so it's just one more thing to think about. Now, I think the first thing you do is lay out your beds and your walkways. At this point, don't even think about what you're going to put into those beds. The one exception would be if you want a vegetable garden, go ahead and pick the sunniest spot in your yard and a spot that is likely to stay sunny, and go ahead and designate that area as your vegetable garden. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a square little box out in the back corner of the yard. You can build up the edges with rock or something. You can have it any shape you like. You can put a little water feature in the front of it so nobody's going to notice the ugly tomato plants behind it. But keep in mind, if you want a vegetable garden, plan that in right away. If you want a cutting garden, again, I think that's another place Europeans are way ahead of us. You walk into any home in Europe, they're probably going to be fresh flowers on the table. Now that fresh flowers are so much more widely, I imagine a lot of y'all keep fresh flowers in your home a lot of the time. Consider growing your own. I mean, I've got a cutting garden along the edge of my vegetable garden now, and I'll be cutting Glamini glads in the near future, cut larkspur earlier. But if you want a cutting garden, that's something, again, that takes up a little bit of room, so plan for it. Herbs, I think everybody should be growing some herbs. But I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is to create an herb garden. Herbs are fascinating plants to use in the landscape. I mean, in an area that you just want a little bit of ground cover, don't plant Asiatic jasmine, plant oregano, plant thyme. Plant mint. If you like mojitos, those things are dangerous. They're just so smooth on a hot afternoon. But mint is a beautiful ground cover. The years that I worked with Alton Grimm up in Bernie, we had a patch of peppermint out in the back part of the nursery that we drove our electric carts back and forth through. And I will admit, I was much younger, and I'd take the electric cart out and just drive back and forth through the patch of peppermint 3 or 4 times just because I wanted the area to smell like peppermint for the afternoon. But I think herbs are one of the most beautiful plants in the landscape and can certainly be used throughout the landscape. There's no reason, unless you have a big dog or something, to concentrate your herbs in one area. Chives are a neat plant. Parsley can be beautiful in beds. Rosemary is one of our most useful landscape plants. If you look out along this this bed that the city forced us to, in effect, create along the front of the building out here, or actually along the street, that's trailing rosemary out there. And anybody that cooks, man, there's just not much better than rosemary for chicken or a lot of other things. But don't feel like you have to plant an herb garden. You can use that rosemary throughout the landscape if you have adequate light. So, we've set aside the gardens that we want to do. Now we're going to get out there and create the beds. And remember that grass uses more water than anything else in your landscape, and it's the highest maintenance thing in your landscape. It's what's going to have to be mowed, it's going to have to be edged, it's going to be the most susceptible to grub worms and things like that. So in my mind, the modern landscape is 20 or 30% grass. It's not the 80 to 90% that old landscapes were. And again, drive around and look and see all the options that you have. I know a lot of beautiful landscapes that have no grass whatsoever, in the yard, and yet they're beautiful. You want something that looks like grass, you can plant dwarf monkey grass. Ornamental grasses, yeah, ornamental grasses are a totally different idea. And ornamental grasses are among the most drought-tolerant plants and can be absolutely beautiful incorporated in the landscape. But if you've got kids or if you've got dogs, you do need to have at least a little bit of grass in the area. And again, next week we're going to talk a little bit about plants and plant materials, but I'll just tell you in advance, if you're going to have grass, I still think that St. Augustine is one of the best grasses you can plant. St. Augustine gets a terribly bad rap because everybody says, oh, it's such a water hog. It's simply not true. It takes just as much water to keep Bermuda or zoysia looking nice as it does to keep St. Augustine looking nice. The difference is, if you stop watering Bermuda or zoysia, it turns brown, and then it comes back when it rains or you water again. If you stop watering St. Augustine, it turns brown of a much more permanent nature. It dies, and you will replace it. But consider the advantages. St. Augustine grows in the shade. Zoysia does not, and Bermuda does not. St. Augustine stays green for the most part, unless we have a real hard winter, 12 months out of the year. Bermuda grass browns out with the first frost in the fall, and it's the last to green up in the spring. And something that I is important to me is St. Augustine grass does not get chiggers, or what some people call red bugs. Everybody know what those are? Everybody know what those things are? Yeah. You'll never have those in St. Augustine, but you certainly will have them in Bermuda or in Zoysia. And believe me, that's important for your kids, and believe it or not, it's important for the dogs. I can't tell you how many times I've been over visiting with a veterinarian friend, Dan Kirby, and somebody's got a dog that's itching just terribly, and he rolls it over, and there are chigger bites all over the dog's tummy. No wonder it's itching. You would be itching too. Yes, ma'am?
Is there more than one kind of St. Augustine?
There are many, many kinds of St. Augustine. And again, I'll talk more about this next Saturday, but stay away from Raleigh. It is very, very susceptible to brown patch. If your yard is shady, stay away from Floritam. Floritam is wonderful St. Augustine for the sun, but not for the shade. Another question? Okay, so lay out where that grass is going to be, and then again you can have fun figuring out where you're going to put the beds in the landscape. Most homes require some foundation planting, because most homes, will have about yay much or up to that much of the slab exposed, and that's one thing you probably want to be sure that you hide with your landscaping. But there is no longer the requirement to have the one little planter box on the front of the house with Japanese boxwood in it. 50 years ago that was mandatory when you built a house. It's not anymore. It's almost mandatory that you don't do that. But most homes will need some sort of planting right along the foundation. So get out there with that water hose, lay it out, move it back and forth. You think you like it one way, stop and take a picture of it with that digital camera, then go back and rework it. Maybe you find something you like better. Maybe you think, well, the way I had it to at first was the way I wanted. You can go back and look at the picture and lay it out that way again. But hoses are wonderful things for creating the look of beds. Now, if you have a big yard, if it is a long way from the house, from the street to your house, there are, again, a lot of ways that you can break that up. Because, again, I mean, you look at it, the only nice thing you can say about it is, wow, that's a big yard. I'm glad I don't have to mow it. But things that you do to break it up, if you got that big expansive yard, it doesn't need to look like a golf course. Even a golf course, they put those bunkers and sand traps and things like that in there so that it's not just one solid mass of grass. You do the same thing, getting out there, create, some flower beds out in that area. Get out and, again, lay out where you want to have these beds, whatever shape you like. And one thing you can do, once again, to create the impression of a little bit more intimacy is, don't just look at it in 2 dimensions, look at it in 3 dimensions. A berm is, in effect, just a raised mound in an area. And in a really big yard, one of the prettiest things you can do is create a bermed up area at one place or more than one place in the yard that you then plant with shrubs, with flowers, with ground covers. But changing the height vertically can make a big difference in how it looks. And I don't know exactly how to tell you to create that when you're trying to figure out how to do it, but maybe it involves getting some old boxes or something out there and literally piling up to make a mound. Also consider the water flow. If you're moving out somewhere like Stone Oak or some of these areas, if it's a really pretty area, it probably does some of this. And there are an awful lot of houses that end up with severe water problems because the water drains right down onto the house. The properly placed berm can go a long way toward diverting that water away. And with that, I want to pause for just a second and talk about something known as a French drain. Because sometimes you will find, almost any landscapes, you can have a low spot where water collects, or you can have that problem where water, just runs down and piles up against the house. And the best way to get rid of water is to move it, to in effect get it off your property. And if you have a lower spot, water flows by gravity. And as long as you have a lower place for the water to go, you can make that water move without being able to see it. Now, if you're sitting down in the valley and you got higher terrain all around you, move. You don't want to have to deal with that. But there are a couple of things you can do. But basically what a French drain is like an underground river. And if you have a place that you have to move water from point A to point B and you don't want it to be seen, you literally dig a trench through that area and you put some water in it. You make sure that the water is flowing from point A to point B and that it will flow just due to gravity. But then what you do is go back in, you put a little bit of gravel in the bottom of that trench, Then you get what is called perforated pipe. It's the same pipe, it's cheap, same pipe they use in septic system lateral lines. And you put one or more pieces of pipe down through this little underground river that you've created. Then you come back and fill it in with more gravel. You can either use the bigger, coarser gravel on top of it, because those holes are about this big around. You can either put the coarser gravel that is not going to go through those holes, or they're actually fabrics, kind of like the shade cloth fabric that you see in the greenhouse, that you actually wrap that perforated pipe with so the soil and the gravel and things don't go into it. You put, one or more pieces of the pipe through the area, and then a little bit of gravel on top, and then the last inch or two can be soil, where the grass can go over the top of it, or the ground cover, or whatever else, but the water moves through underneath. Are French drains useful? I'm probably standing right now on top of a French drain that's about 4 feet deep, has 3 giant pieces of perforated pipe in it, and when we first built the nursery, we had a real severe water problem, and water collected just horribly as you got up toward the building. There's a trench that goes from kind of the corner right up there, right back to this drainage easement back here. You'd never know that you're standing or sitting on an underground river, but in times of real heavy rain, you can go back there and see the water come out of it. So French drains are an important thing to know about because water is a consideration in creating this landscape plan. Yes, ma'am?
Do they put dirt right on top of the perforated pipe, and if so, how come the pipe doesn't fill in?
No, the pipe goes in, gravel goes on top of the pipe, and then dirt goes on top of the gravel.
Okay. Some sort of foam?
I'm sorry?
You said you could wrap the pipe in some sort of foam?
It's called Mirify fabric.
Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah. And that'll keep the stuff from going into
Does
it.
it have to be angled?
The water has to flow. Yeah. It doesn't have to be angled a lot, but it has to have, that's why I say when you dig the trench, you then put the water in and be sure the water's running through as an open trench. Then you simply close the trench up with something to move it inside.
What about gutters?
Gutters are up to you, and for the most part, gutters serve 2 purposes. They keep the water from crashing down on top of the plants that are planted in front, and they give you an opportunity for rainwater catchment. And as we move into the future, rainwater catchment is going to be more and more important. So yes, I'm in most cases very much in favor of gutters. Yes, ma'am.
I have a situation in my yard where I cannot do either of those alternatives that you suggested. And what I have been considering is heavy planting of shrubs, and then in some areas some type of a ground cover. And I'm wondering if I plant a lot of plants and have a heavy growth, will that hold the dirt and keep the water from washing it in?
That will greatly reduce erosion, but it doesn't eliminate the problem of standing water and the potential damage that can do. But yes, proper planting will very definitely eliminate erosion. We'll talk about that in just a second. We're going to talk about one other way to get rid of water. If you can't dig a trench and carry water from point A to point B via a French drain, you can create what is called a sump. And a sump is merely, think of this as an underground lake that you allow the water to collect in, and then you pump the water out of that particular thing, out of that particular place. Because of some things that the neighbors down there did, changing the grade, we have a lot of water that comes this way. And believe it or not, this area right outside of the seminar area, if we have a really heavy rain, we would have water stand 4 or 6 inches deep. And Murphy's Law says that as soon as the water gets 6 inches deep, somebody walks in and says, "Where are your trees?" And and you're back out there ankle deep in water. So once again, if you were to look outside, we need to disguise it better in the future, but if you look outside of this wall of the seminar area, you will see a sump. It's literally like a garbage can that was dug and sunk down into the ground, has a jillion holes drilled into the side of it, and has this same pea gravel filled in around it. And it's like I say, it's sitting right out there. If this is of interest to you, you can look on your way out. But down inside of that sump is a sump pump. And this thing works on a float valve. The water, once it fills up to a certain level, it brings a little float. When it gets up above this point, it turns on the pump. The pump pumps all the water out. It goes out through a pipe, goes down that drainage easement out back. And if you have a low spot in your yard where water collects and you simply can't divert it through use of a French drain, you can put in a sump pump. There is a sump pump on the front of our building, right out where we put the bags of materials out front. That's something I put in, I want to say about, well, we put it in when we did the addition to the nursery in 1990. So that would be that it's been, 17 years that it's been out there. Have never opened the top of it, have never looked inside of it, but every time water collects, it turns on and pumps all the water gone and out of the place. So some pumps are just, again, a very interesting thing to know about if you have drainage issues. Okay, so now we're back to our landscape plan. Yes, sir.
Would you discuss dry stream beds as an aesthetic way to solve drainage problems?
Dry stream beds can be very attractive. The illusion, in effect, of a dry stream bed that you have created, can be an attractive feature in a landscape and can also serve as a way to move water from, or to allow water to move through. I see the most effective uses of this in larger lots where there is a natural drainage flow through it. And you can take what is in effect an existing stream bed and make it look a lot nicer, lining it with rock, sometimes putting an interesting bridge over it can be an interesting architectural feature. The big problem with stream beds is weeds, because they're hard to mow, it's hard to keep the weeds out of them, and it's hard to keep a dry stream bed looking nice. That's my only objection to the dry stream bed look. But it can be useful. Yes, ma'am.
If you're doing a dry stream bed, do you put small stones down first and then build up the larger ones at the top, or vice versa? Or?
I just would have your large stones stable. It depends on how much water moves through the area. If this is an area where you're looking at significant erosion, you may actually set the stones in concrete. No, I would basically have one layer of stone in contact with the soil underneath it and butt it together as tightly as possible. And the bigger the stones you use, the fewer weeds can grow between them. Yes?
If you're going to convert from, let's say, a lawn of grass, and you want to get rid of the grass, what's the easiest? Can you just lay plastic on it and kill it?
Again, you're kind of getting into what I want to talk about next week, but yes, the best way to get rid of grass is to solarize it, to moisten the soil first. That's important. Moisten the soil underneath, put your plastic on top, doesn't matter whether it's black or clear, weight down the edges and give it 6 weeks. That's better than any chemical or any organic method for killing grass.
What about newspaper? That doesn't work as well as the
Doesn't work nearly as well. Newspaper will kill St. Augustine, but it doesn't work well against Bermuda, and it doesn't work at all against nutgrass. The other thing I should very definitely mention is if you have thought about having a swimming pool someday, put that into your plan. Even if it's just, well, someday we're going to put a pool back there, go ahead and draw that onto your plan as a potential future feature, and then go ahead and plant or whatever you like in that area. But don't put any water lines, any electric lines, or any big trees in that area that you might have a swimming pool someday. And that way, if the budget or whatever allows, in the future, you can come back in and put in a pool with minimum disruption to what you already have. Take it from someone who cleaned swimming pools as a way of making money when he was in college. Nobody in their right mind has a swimming pool unless you can afford to pay somebody to come do the work for you. It's a pain. Question? Okay. Okay, so now we're getting down more to the fun parts. We have sort of laid out where we want our beds. We've laid out where we want to put in berms or additional beds out in the yard. Then we can start thinking about plant material. And I realize this is just the reverse of what most people do. Most people want to go buy the plants and then find a place to put them. But in creating a landscape plan, you got to know, it's like picking out the paint color before you build a house. You got to know where you're going to have these plants. You've got to have some idea of how much space you're going to have. And once you literally get your plan done, then you go back and choose the plants that will work in that area. But all your choices aren't through yet. Again, this business of getting the beds laid out, and again, you may have made several tracings. It takes a while to figure out exactly where you want the beds. Again, I recommend that you drive around and look at other properties, look through magazines, things like that, and play with it. You can have a lot of fun doing this, and don't plan on doing it in a weekend. It's going to take a much longer period of time than that to really come up with the design that you really, really like. Now, once you've gotten past where you're going to have the beds and things like that, then you need to think about the major plant features that you want to have in your landscape. Do you want trees? Do you need to add trees, or do you need to take away trees? Again, I have a lot of people that say, I just really, really, really want a vegetable garden, but all my property's all covered up with oaks. Well, you got a choice. Chainsaw on the oaks, or you get a vegetable garden. There's no in between. So trees are the slowest feature to grow and develop, and they're probably going to be the first thing that you're going to plant when you get around to planting. But look at that landscape plan, and the first thing that you put into that plan is going to be, you know, where you want trees. And of course, like I said, you've already drawn into that thing where your existing trees are. You've got to get out and study the shade patterns that the trees create, and also the shade patterns that the house creates. And where you have your plan, where you have the trees located and things like that, now you're going to go back in and draw an area that is shaded by that tree, or the area that's shaded by the house, because we have to choose plants according to the amount of sunlight that they are going to receive. And once again, you've got to take in mind the change of seasons, because a bed that's in full sun in the middle of the winter may be totally shaded in the summer, or vice versa. So study and plan for what the shade patterns are going to be. Obviously, one of the first things to do is to figure out which direction your house faces. And I know that sounds silly, but if I ask every one of you, you know, what direction does your house face? North, south, east, or west, whatever. A lot of people, I love it, man and wife are in here, and she says east and he says northwest. And then they look at each other. And you don't want to get in the middle of that argument. You send them home and tell them what a compass is. Or maybe you could be like the lady that was in one time, and I said, well, ma'am, what direction does your house face? And she looked at me and perfectly seriously said, well, to the front, of course. So, I don't know whether it faces north, south, east, or west, because your shade patterns are going to be very, very important in what you choose to plant. Now, the next thing after we've got the beds laid out in 2 dimensions, we're going to start thinking in 3 dimensions. We're going to start thinking of where we want taller plants, where we want lower plants, and where we want ground covers. Like I say, on the ends of the home, for the most part, you're going to want to obscure the end of your house, because it simply creates a little more interest if you don't see all these things. And like I say, if you're going to create a little private garden or something like that, wall it off with some shrubs or something like that. A lot of homes will actually, you can have more than one garden. You've got your front garden, you've got your back garden, you've got your private garden, and you can create distinct different areas. And it can make a landscape very interesting to feel like you're moving from one area into a totally different area. And you do that with your plantings. You kind of screen it off. And I personally would never want to be able to stand here and see all the way to the back corner of the landscape. Boring. I want something out there that blocks off a bit of that you have to wander around and find out what's back there. I have the pleasure right now of being on a committee down at the San Antonio Botanical Gardens, where we have actually paid a firm about $150,000 to draw a whole new master plan for the garden. And it is fun. It's going to be, you're going to see some wonderful things. The garden's already changed so much with our new director down there. But listening to some of the world authorities on landscape garden design and hearing them talk about these things just really establishes the things that I think are important. So when you think about the plants that you use, now we're going to think in 3 dimensions, and there's nothing wrong with, in effect, screening off different parts of your landscape and creating your own little different areas in there. But there's some places you don't want to have something really tall. You obviously don't want to have a real tall plant right in front of windows that you want to look in or out of. You don't want to have something so close to your new sidewalk that it's going to encroach out into the sidewalk. But at the same time, there are areas in the landscape you want something higher and areas that you want something lower. And you go through and you kind of make those notes. Maybe that raised up, burned up area you put out in the yard, you put 8-foot crepe myrtles toward the top of it, and then you've got some lower plantings, some colorful althias or something, and down in front of that you've got some perennials. Below that you've got ground cover. But just you're working in layers, and you kind of have to think 3-dimensionally, but now you've got your beds laid out. Now let's create different layers of where we want the different heights. And I'm a terrible artist. I can't draw. I would never show you anything that I drew. So you draw your own plans, you don't have to show them to anybody else. But now let's create that front elevation of the house, and then you sketch in where you want high and low, or if you're looking at it from the street, set the house back here and just play. It's going to look terrible unless you're an artist, and I envy people very much who can, but so just draw to your heart's content and don't tell anybody what you've done. Keep your pictures to yourself. But start thinking three-dimensionally and get an idea of where you want high plants, low plants, and where you would want ground covers or things right at ground level. Then the next thing, we're not to individual plants yet. The next thing is to ask yourself, how much maintenance do you want to do on that landscape? Do you want to go out? I think basically in a landscape, you should have to prune it once a year, feed it 2 or 3 times a year, and water it in between times, and that's your basic landscape plan. If you want to have flowers and you want the most color, then you plant annual beds, but you're going to change those things out 2 or 3 times a year. If you want color that comes back, like we like to say, you want to plant perennial beds. Because those, it doesn't mean there's no maintenance involved, but it means you don't dig them up and replace them every year. But decide realistically how much time you want to spend in the landscape. Some of us love working in the landscape. For some of us, it's the release. It's, I get so frustrated with employees and other things sometimes that I just have to take an axe and go out and chop down a few cedar trees. But gardening is becoming more of an important pastime to an awful lot of people. And you really need to ask yourself realistically how much time you want to spend in the landscape. If you want to spend more time in the landscape, then you can certainly plant those annual beds. If you want to spend more money in the landscape, you can plant those annual beds because you're going to be replacing the plants more often out there. But that's what really sets a landscape apart. My term that I came up with is what I call the wow factor. You want people to drive down the street and look at your yard and say, wow. Then that's where you're going to really want color. But color means more work than green shrubs do. I mean, you can plant a landscape if you have a very busy life, plant it around trees, evergreen shrubs, evergreen ground covers, and slow growing, if any, grasses. You can have a landscape that no one has to spend 5 or 6 hours a year out in the yard working. But it's going to be a green landscape. I'm not going to say it's going to be boring. But if you want a really exciting landscape, then you're probably going to want to create a fair amount of color. One of the few intelligent things I think Steve George said when he was our county agent here was you can tell a really successful, colorful landscape by the amount of tire marks on the curb where people have run off the road trying to see what it is that you have planted over there. And color is what really sets a landscape apart. Now, color doesn't have to be a lot of work. And a lot of plants that used to be hard to grow in the past are a lot easier. You say rose garden to somebody, and most people think, oh my God, black spot and sprays and bugs and pruning and all of that. Well, you've never obviously been introduced to something like one of the new knockout roses. These things grow in spite of you rather than because of you. And a lot of the old-fashioned roses, what we call the own-root roses, are the same way. If you have a sunny yard, you can have a beautiful rose garden with virtually no work whatsoever. If you want that cutting garden, there are things you can plant that really make good cut flowers that you can bring inside. And actually, there are a lot of interesting things that you can use that make great complements to cut flowers. Pittosporum, you go down to Travis Wholesale, they're selling branches of pittosporum in there as filler for flower arrangements. We have a type of asparagus fern up there called Ming fern. It's actually not a fern at all, it's an asparagus, Asparagus myriad. Well, it's related to this. This is a so-called foxtail. This is Asparagus myri, the other is Asparagus myrioclatus. But you can grow some fascinating foliages to use in there. But you have to decide what you want in the way of color versus green. And then, again, you start laying out those particular areas. You've got your plan there with your beds in it. Typically, your flowers, your annuals will be toward the front of a bed, although in some cases, if you want to do a big annual bed, then you go with several different tiers. You can plant tall cosmos in the back, you can plant lower whatever salvias in the middle, and maybe down in front of that you can plant lower growing alyssum or periwinkles or whatever else. You can do the same thing with perennials. If you're going to use perennials, you have to do a little bit more planning and be sure that you really understand the plants. Because annuals are nice. They die and they go away in 6 or 8 months. And if you made a mistake, it's gone 6 months later. If you make a mistake in planting your trees, shrubs, and perennials, They're going to be there. And once again, just like you should not be married to whatever's in the landscape right now, you shouldn't be afraid to make changes a little bit further on. You know, if you decide you made a mistake, dig it up, cut it down, whatever, and plant something else in that area. And then beyond that, it's really just a matter of selecting the plants. And the most important thing in plant selection is how big does it get and how much light, how much sunlight does it require. Also, you want to keep in mind whether it keeps its leaves in the winter or loses its leaves in the winter. But please understand the mature size of plants. As a nursery, we don't really have very many mature plants around here. That's something long-term we plan to use this parking lot for, is to plant more things so that you can see what they will be when they grow up. It's a great thing you can do driving around the neighborhood, but even more so going down to the botanical garden and seeing what a plant grows into. Green pittosporum, I mean, this is a pretty little 1-gallon container right there. I have a green pittosporum outside the back door of my home. I don't know how long it's been there. I'm sure it's older than I am. The trunk at the base is about this big around. The plant is as high as the roof of this building, only because I've pruned it down, and it is as wide as from this post to this post. In fact, it's wider than that. When you buy that little plant this size, you probably don't think about it. There's a wonderful rose bush that they call mutabilis, or butterfly rose. We had this argument with Wendy the other day because she has a new home and she's working on landscaping. She said, oh no, it's going to be a nice little plant. We say, drive up here and look at the mutabilis in front of Uta Beck's place. It's as wide as from here to that wall, and just understand, you know, this thing's like a puppy. You better know what the breed is if you're going to know how big it is going to be when it gets grown up. But keep in mind the mature size of plants, not just width, but also height. There are more dead photinias around this area because people prune them to death. They plant a photinia and they want to keep it 5 feet tall. Guess what? Photinia grows 12 feet tall, and the more you prune on it, the sicker it gets. And so, again, enough said. Just understand the mature size of the plants and allow for that when you plant. When you want to create a dense growth, you don't really have to worry about planting things too closely. You want to screen out that ugly neighbor over there, you can put those plants in 3 feet apart and have an instant screen, and it's really not going to be a problem to be crowded together like that. But you got to understand how big it's going to get and how tall it's going to get. That's what's going to cause you problems in the long run. And there are an absolute horribly large number of landscape designers around that do landscapes the way I do cut flowers. I do beautiful cut flower arrangements, and my secret is buy as much as you can and cram as much as you can into the vase, and given just a tiny amount of talent, you will make it look absolutely beautiful. And there are an awful lot of landscapers that plan for how the landscape's going to look the day they get finished putting it in. And it looks great, and they go away and you're happy. And 5 years later, you've got a monster that is just totally out of control. So, when you go back with these beds, think about when you're actually selecting the individual plants, keep in mind how large they're going to get at maturity. And I will tell you, unless you live on an estate-sized lot, probably half the plants that you like are not suitable for your landscape because they're going to get too big if you're going to have much variety at all in your landscape. And you say, oh, I love mutabilis roses. Fine. Plant those as a hedge along the back fence where they can grow 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide. But don't think you're going to incorporate them in your little individual beds around the house because they're simply going to get too big. So I really want you, first of all, think about whether you want it evergreen, whether you want color. Think about how much time and how much money you're willing to put into maintaining that landscape. And then you're really able to start making your plant selections. Now next week I want to talk about how you plant, how you prepare the soil, the things that you do to keep things properly maintained. And if anybody's so far along that you want to create a little basic plan and bring it with you and say, oh, this is what I'm thinking about, bring me a picture of your house, and we'll look over it quickly and tell you, hey, you're on the right track, you're on the wrong track, whatever. Yes, ma'am.
Another thing to remember is how much shedding and other messy things are going to happen. In Florida, I had an orchid tree that I had to cut down. It dropped leaves and flowers and seeds.
You know, that's a real important point, and a point that we should certainly talk about. If you, for some reason, want to have a swimming pool, don't plant a crepe myrtle next to it. And same thing's true even if you're going to have a water feature of some sort. Maybe even a fountain. I mean, there are certain things we do to get around it. A lot of people take this fountain home and then they find that it gets clogged constantly from the tassels and leaves and everything else. You get around that by taking one of these things called a painter's paint straining bag. Put your pump inside in that, your pump doesn't clog nearly as much. But that's a real important point, because flowering plants may tend to shed. Some plants that drop their leaves. Everybody knows how the live oaks drop those leaves in the spring. Can be a real issue, so that is very definitely something important to keep in mind. Yes, sir.
Outside the city, deer problems are a huge consideration. And rabbits.
The only way to stop things consistently is with a fence. My yard now, after about 1.5 years effort on my part, has about maybe 1,000 feet of 7.5-foot fence around it, and that's the only way that you will ever stop deer. You can discourage deer with the repellents, and if you're very religious about it, you can keep them away. But most of the repellents last for 30 days. And somewhere off in the woods, there's a deer sitting there with a little calendar saying, 29 days and he hadn't sprayed, 30 days he hadn't sprayed, let's go for dinner. Because the deer know, when it goes away. Now again, if you're in an area that has a reasonable deer population, it's not as much of a problem. But with most of the areas, we've done away with all the deer's natural predators. We've gotten rid of the mountain lions, the coyotes. Biggest predator we did away with was the screwworm, which killed a large number of fawns every year. Doesn't happen anymore. We've cut the land up into little subdivisions where people don't hunt like they once did. And the great majority of the areas around here, we are just horribly overrun with deer that eat everything. I've told people like Fair Oaks, they've either got to trap the deer or raise the speed limit. One way or another, you've got to get the population down. But if you have serious issues with deer, and that's real important. You can always fence your backyard. Sometimes you can't fence your front yard. But the only way you're going to keep them out is with a fence. Out front, you choose plants that are more deer resistant, and you invest stock in the Bobex company or something like that. There are some things you can do, because there are a handful of plants that deer simply do not eat. Mainly things with a strong aromatic quality. Things like rosemary, not going to eat rosemary. There's a cute little plant out here called Damianita, grows in the Jeep roads up and down my ranch, and the deer will not touch it. We had one lady out Hill Country Village area that actually kept the deer away from her cyclamen by planting 1 rosemary, 3 cyclamen, 1 rosemary, 3 cyclamen. And they hated the smell of the rosemary so much they stopped eating her cyclamen. But you're right, deer are a real serious concern, and if you really want to garden and you have deer, plan on building that fence. Again, a fence doesn't have to be unattractive. The area up here to the left of our bedding plant area, when we conceived that and I built that, there was an ugly warehouse building next to us. Great people that had a ceramic design place. But we didn't want to have to look at that. So what we did is built a fence with those welded wire panels, planted the Confederate jasmine, and ultimately it didn't matter. We bought the property and tore the warehouse down. But you can create fences without having to give up a lot of space. But again, fence doesn't have to be ugly. It can be wrought iron if you want a fence to look at, or it can be some material that you cover with vines. I tend to not like to look at fences per se. I want to either cover them with plants or have them, built out of an interesting material to begin with. But long answer to a short question: if you got deer, you've got problems. Rabbits are a little easier to repel. There's some repellents, and again, low fencing. You don't have to build it nearly as high to keep the rabbits out.
We've had good luck with your shakeaway.
Shakeaway works against some deer. But I live west of Bernie, Roberta lives north of Bergheim, Donna lives Leon Springs. The deer eat things in my yard, or at least they used to, they didn't touch in Donna's yard. The deer eat things in Donna's yard that they didn't eat in Roberta's yard. I think they're different little ethnic sections of deer. These are Italian deer, and they love oregano. These deer over here are, Mexicans. They don't like Italian stuff, but boy, they eat those hot peppers that you put out. These deer over here are Asian, whatever else. But deer are a problem. If shakeaway works well for you, continue using it. For rabbits and squirrels, yeah.
Not deer.
Rabbits and bushy-tailed tree rats. We don't call them squirrels.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes. I will happily stay and answer as many questions. Has this given y'all a starting point, at least things to think about when you're doing landscape design? You're going to come up with a jillion questions as you go along. We're always here to answer those questions. I mean, I'm not going to draw the plan for you. You'll have more fun doing it yourself. But we'll look forward to doing it. Next week, I want to talk about things like grass varieties, like killing the grass out, like a little bit of how to install so you use the least amount of water, the least amount of fertilizer, and have the fewest maintenance issues in the future. I know there are questions, and I'm going to stay here and answer questions as long as you like. Those of y'all that want to go start drawing, you're not going to embarrass me by getting up and running out right now. So, feel free.